In the autumn of 1989, something terrifying happened to French President François Mitterrand. The Berlin Wall had just come crashing down, and across Europe, millions of people celebrated what seemed like the end of an era. But in Paris, behind the gilded doors of the Élysée Palace, Mitterrand was not celebrating. According to his closest advisors, he was having what they described as a little fit of rage that went on for hours. You see, Mitterrand understood something that most people celebrating in the streets did not. A unified Germany would fundamentally shift the balance of power in Europe. The Germans had been divided since 1945, deliberately kept weak and split as punishment for 2 world wars. Now, practically overnight, that was about to change. The question that kept Mitterrand up at night was simple but profound. How do you contain a rising power without going to war? His answer would reshape European history. Mitterrand would build Germany a cage, a monetary prison cell designed to forever dilute German power and restore French prestige on the continent. The weapon of choice was not an army, but a currency, the euro. But here is where this story takes an unexpected turn. 3 decades later, it is not Germany trapped inside that cage. It is France. And the irony is almost too perfect. The country that designed the monetary union as a constraint on German power now finds itself strangled by the very same mechanism, while Germany has used it to become the undisputed economic master of Europe. This is the story of the euro deception, how France tried to cage Germany and ended up locking itself in. What makes this tale so compelling is that it was not a case of incompetence or ignorance. The French architects of monetary union were sophisticated strategists who understood power politics deeply. They made what seemed at the time like a brilliant move, trading German reunification for monetary integration. They believed they were purchasing influence over Germany's future forever. Instead, they purchased their own economic imprisonment. To understand why Mitterrand was so afraid in 1989, you have to understand the humiliating position France had been in for decades. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Europe had what was effectively a German-dominated monetary system, even though nobody called it that publicly. The Deutsche Mark had become the most powerful currency on the continent. And the reason was simple. Germans were obsessed with inflation. This obsession was not irrational. Germans had lived through not 1 but 2 total currency collapses during the 20th century. The hyperinflation of the 1920s had wiped out the savings of an entire generation and helped pave the way for the rise of Adolf Hitler. Then again, after World War II, Germans lost everything when the Reichsmark was replaced. These traumas scarred the national psyche so deeply that stable money became practically a religion in Germany. The Bundesbank, Germany's central bank, was designed with complete independence from political interference. Its singular mandate was to maintain price stability, and it pursued this goal with religious fervor. Between 1949 and 1999, Germany's average inflation rate was just 2.7%, one of the lowest in the developed world. The result was that the Deutsche Mark became the anchor currency of Europe, the currency everyone else had to measure themselves against. For France, this created an impossible situation. Throughout the 1980s, the French franc was constantly under pressure against the Deutsche Mark. Whenever France tried to stimulate its economy with looser monetary policy, the franc would weaken against the mark, capital would flee to Germany, and France would be forced into embarrassing devaluations. Each devaluation was a public humiliation, a sign that France could not keep up with its neighbor across the Rhine. What made it worse was that France had essentially no control over this situation. The European monetary system, which was supposed to coordinate currencies across the continent, worked in practice like a greater Deutsche Mark zone. Whenever the Bundesbank raised interest rates to fight inflation in Germany, other European central banks had to follow suit, even if their own economies desperately needed lower rates. France, Italy, and the smaller European countries were essentially following orders from Frankfurt, the home of the Bundesbank. For proud French politicians who saw themselves as the natural leaders of Europe, this was intolerable. France had nuclear weapons, a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, and a history of global empire. Yet, in economic terms, they were vassals of the Germans. The French elite began searching for a solution, and by the late 1980s, they believed they had found one. The idea was elegant in its simplicity. If you cannot beat Germany's currency, eliminate it. Replace the Deutsche Mark with a new European currency, governed by a European central bank, where France would have an equal vote. Germany would no longer be able to dictate monetary policy unilaterally. Power would be shared. French influence would be restored. French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing had first proposed this idea in the 1970s, but it went nowhere because Germany had no reason to give up the power that came with the Deutsche Mark. The Bundesbank was perfectly happy running Europe's monetary policy. Why would Germany surrender that? This is where Mitterrand saw his opportunity. The fall of the Berlin Wall changed everything. Suddenly, Germany needed something from France and from the rest of Europe. They needed approval for reunification. In the spring of 1990, Mitterrand and German Chancellor Helmut Kohl met in secret. What happened in that meeting would set the course of European history for the next 3 decades. Mitterrand offered Kohl a deal. France would not stand in the way of German reunification. In exchange, Germany would give up the mighty Deutsche Mark and commit irrevocably to a European common currency. This was enormous. The Deutsche Mark was not just a currency to Germans, it was a symbol of their rehabilitation after the ruins of World War II, proof that Germany had rebuilt itself into a modern, stable, prosperous nation. Giving it up meant surrendering a piece of national identity. But Kohl was a committed European integrationist. He had grown up in the generation that witnessed the horrors of war, and he genuinely believed that European unity was the only way to prevent future conflicts. More practically, he needed French support for reunification. Without it, there was a real danger that the process could be blocked or delayed indefinitely. According to Karl Otto Perl, who was president of the Bundesbank at the time, the European Monetary Union would not have come about without German reunification. And conversely, German reunification might not have happened without the agreement on monetary union. The two were inextricably linked in a grand political bargain. The Maastricht Treaty of 1992 formalized the deal. The treaty established the framework for the European Union as we know it today and set out the roadmap for creating a common currency. The euro was born, at least on paper. But here is where France made a critical miscalculation. They believed that creating a European central bank would dilute German monetary power. In reality, the European Central Bank was designed almost entirely on the German model. It was based in Frankfurt, the home of the Bundesbank. Its primary mandate was price stability, exactly like the Bundesbank. Its first president, Wim Duisenberg, was a known inflation hawk who shared the Bundesbank's philosophy. Germany had agreed to give up the Deutsche Mark, but they had effectively replaced it with a continental version of the same thing. The ECB would pursue the same anti-inflationary policies that the Bundesbank had pursued. The only difference was that now those policies would apply to all of Europe, not just Germany. France believed they had purchased a seat at the table. What they actually got was a seat in a room where the rules had already been written by Germans. Hubert Védrine, one of Mitterrand's closest advisors, later acknowledged that the president would hardly have agreed to reunification without German concessions on monetary union. The French genuinely believed this was a win. They thought they had found a way to permanently anchor German power within European institutions, to make sure Berlin could never again act unilaterally the way it had with monetary policy in the past. What they did not fully appreciate was that institutional design matters far more than institutional membership. You can put France and Germany in the same room, but if the room was built according to German specifications, Germany still sets the terms. When the euro was physically introduced in 2002, replacing the national currencies of a dozen European countries, many people believed it would usher in an era of shared prosperity. The common currency was supposed to eliminate exchange rate risk, boost trade, and bring the economies of Europe closer together. In some ways, it did exactly that, but it also created something else, a massive and growing divergence between Germany and France. The numbers tell the story more clearly than any words could. In the years leading up to the euro, both Germany and France ran modest trade surpluses. Their economies were roughly comparable in terms of competitiveness, but in the 2 decades after the euro's introduction, these paths diverged dramatically. Germany's trade surplus exploded. The country became an export powerhouse, selling its cars, machinery, and manufactured goods to the rest of Europe and the world. By recent years, Germany has been running annual trade surpluses of over 200 billion euros. France, meanwhile, slipped into persistent trade deficits. The country that had once been Germany's equal was now importing more than it exported, watching its industrial base hollow out. How did this happen? The answer lies in the subtle mechanics of how a currency union actually works, and in the strategic choices Germany made that France failed to match. In the early 2000s, Germany was actually struggling economically. The country was called the sick man of Europe by commentators at the time. Unemployment was high, growth was stagnant, and the costs of reunification were still weighing heavily on the national budget. In response, Germany embarked on a series of aggressive reforms known as the Hartz reforms, named after the committee chairman who designed them. These reforms fundamentally restructured the German labor market. They made it easier for companies to hire and fire workers, cut unemployment benefits, and created incentives for workers to accept lower-paying jobs. The result was significant wage restraint. Real wages in Germany stagnated for years, even as productivity continued to grow. Workers were essentially accepting smaller slices of a growing pie. This had a profound effect on Germany's competitiveness. With wages held down, German products became relatively cheaper compared to those of other European countries. German exports boomed. And here is the critical point. Under normal circumstances, this would have caused the German currency to appreciate. A stronger currency would have made German exports more expensive again, eventually restoring balance. But Germany no longer had its own currency. It had the euro. And the euro's value was determined not by Germany alone, but by the entire eurozone. Countries like Spain, Greece, and Italy were running trade deficits and had weaker economies. This pulled down the euro's value compared to what a standalone German currency would have been worth. According to analysis by the International Monetary Fund, the euro has been undervalued for Germany by somewhere between 5 and 15%. In other words, Germany has been competing in global markets with what is effectively an artificially cheap currency. This gave German exporters an enormous advantage, one they exploited ruthlessly. France, meanwhile, was trapped. French companies were competing against German ones using the same currency, but French wages had not been suppressed in the same way. French products were more expensive and French market share eroded. Without the ability to devalue its currency, something France had done repeatedly before the euro, there was no easy way out. The common currency that was supposed to constrain German power had instead turbocharged the German export machine while tying France's hands behind its back. Today, the contrast between Germany and France has never been starker. Germany runs massive trade surpluses and has reduced its public debt to manageable levels. France, meanwhile, is sliding toward fiscal crisis. According to the International Monetary Fund, France's budget deficit is projected to remain at around 6% of GDP for the foreseeable future. The country's public debt is expected to reach 128% of GDP by 2030, a level comparable to where Greece was when it triggered the Eurozone debt crisis a decade ago. France is now the biggest spender relative to its economic output in all of Europe. Markets are taking notice. French borrowing costs have risen sharply, and the gap between French and German government bond yields has widened to levels not seen since the depths of the Eurozone crisis in 2012. At one point recently, French bonds were yielding more than Italian bonds, a stunning reversal given that Italy has historically been considered the riskier borrower. And here is the darkest irony of all. France is now trapped in what economists call a euro straitjacket. If France were not part of the Eurozone, it could respond to its economic problems the way it did in the past, by devaluing its currency and loosening monetary policy. A cheaper French currency would make French exports more competitive and French tourism more attractive. Looser monetary policy would stimulate demand. But France cannot do any of this. Monetary policy is set by the European Central Bank for all of the Eurozone, and that policy has to balance the needs of Germany, with its low inflation expectations, against the needs of struggling southern economies. France has no independent lever to pull. Even worse, any attempt to cut France's budget deficit through austerity measures risks pushing the country into recession. Without the ability to offset budget cuts with monetary stimulus or currency depreciation, fiscal consolidation becomes much more painful. This is exactly what happened to Greece, Portugal, and Spain during the Eurozone crisis. Marine Le Pen, the leader of France's National Rally Party, has described the euro in vivid terms. She called it a knife stuck in our ribs to make us go where others want us to go. The irony, of course, is that France is the country that designed this knife. France, meanwhile, failed to make the same reforms. French labor markets remained rigid, public spending remained high. The social welfare state, generous by any measure, continued to expand. These might be perfectly defensible policy choices in isolation, but they were catastrophic in a currency union with a more competitive neighbor. The fundamental problem is that a currency union requires its members to converge economically. If one country is more productive and competitive than another, the normal mechanism to restore balance is for exchange rates to adjust. Stronger economies get stronger currencies, which makes their exports more expensive and eventually slows down their advantage. Weaker economies get weaker currencies, which makes their exports cheaper and helps them recover. Within the Eurozone, this mechanism does not exist. The only way for a struggling country to become competitive again is through what economists grimly call internal devaluation. Cutting wages, slashing costs, and enduring years of high unemployment until prices adjust downward. It is a brutal process, as Greece discovered when its economy contracted by a quarter during the crisis years. France has not yet faced a crisis on that scale, but the trajectory is concerning. Public finances are unsustainable. Political will for reform is absent. The population remains resistant to any reduction in living standards or social benefits. And the euro means there is no escape valve. No way to restore competitiveness without going through the wringer of internal adjustment. Perhaps the deepest irony is that Germany did not even need the euro to become Europe's dominant economy. Germany was already dominant before the common currency existed. The Deutsche Mark was already the anchor of European monetary policy. Other countries were already following Bundesbank decisions whether they wanted to or not. The euro simply institutionalized this reality while giving Germany additional benefits. German exporters got an undervalued currency that made their products artificially competitive. German savers got access to the entire continent as a capital market. German banks lent freely to other Eurozone countries, earning interest on loans that seemed safe because they were denominated in a currency Germany controlled. When things went wrong, as they did during the Eurozone crisis, starting in 2010, it was Germany that called the shots on the response. German taxpayers were the ones with the money to bail out struggling countries, and German politicians set the conditions. The famous troika of the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the International Monetary Fund that imposed austerity on Greece was heavily influenced by German views about fiscal discipline. France, despite being the second largest economy in the Eurozone, found itself on the sidelines. The European Commission even waived French violations of the budget rules at one point, with Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker reportedly explaining it was because it's France. The message was clear. France was too big to be disciplined, but not big enough to lead. What comes next is uncertain, but the options are not encouraging. France faces the choice between painful reform, which its political system seems incapable of delivering, and continued drift toward fiscal crisis. Neither path leads to French resurgence as the equal partner of Germany in European affairs. Some observers suggest that the only solution is more Europe, not less. If the Eurozone had a true fiscal union, with transfers from richer to poorer regions, the way the United States transfers money between states, then the imbalances could be managed. If there were jointly issued European bonds, backed by all member states, then weaker countries would not face higher borrowing costs. But Germany has consistently resisted these ideas. Why would German taxpayers agree to subsidize French deficits or Italian debt? Each step toward fiscal union means German money flowing to countries that Germans perceive as less responsible. The political will for such transfers does not exist, certainly not on the scale that would be required. Others suggest that the euro was always doomed to fail, at least in its current form. The economist Milton Friedman predicted before the euro was even introduced that the project would fall apart during its first major recession. He argued that a currency union without political union was inherently unstable, because countries would have no mechanism to respond to localized shocks. Events have largely proven him right, even if the euro has survived longer than he expected. France's current predicament is the culmination of decades of strategic error. Mitterrand believed he was constraining German power by binding Germany into a monetary union. Instead, he created a system that amplified German strengths while exposing French weaknesses. The cage France built for Germany became France's prison. As you watch the headlines about French political turmoil, budget crises, and rising bond yields, remember that this is not just the story of one country's fiscal mismanagement. It is the story of a grand strategic gamble that went horribly wrong. France tried to use monetary integration as a tool of geopolitics, to lock Germany into a system where French interests would be represented equally. Instead, the system locked France into German terms. The Deutsche Mark died, but its spirit lives on in the European Central Bank. The Bundesbank gave up its monopoly on European monetary policy, but its philosophy now governs a continent. Germany trades with an undervalued currency, while France struggles with one that it cannot adjust. And, perhaps most painfully, the French elite who designed this system are now trapped by their own creation. Leaving the euros would trigger financial chaos, bank runs, and a currency collapse that would make past devaluations look mild. But staying in the euro means continued stagnation, rising debt, and permanent subordination to an economic order that serves German interests. The cage is complete, the door is locked, and France is on the inside. The story continues to unfold in real time. Every few months, a new French government falls or a new budget crisis erupts. Bond traders nervously eye French debt, while European officials issue bland reassurances that everything is under control. Meanwhile, German factories hum along, German unemployment stays low, and German politicians lecture their French counterparts about fiscal responsibility. The question that haunts Europe now is whether this arrangement can survive. A currency union built on such fundamental imbalances, where one country systematically wins and others systematically lose, creates political pressures that may eventually prove unsustainable. Populist movements on both the left and right are rising across Europe, and many of them trace their grievances back to the economic structures of the Eurozone. The euro was supposed to unite Europe. In many ways, it has divided it more deeply than ever. If the story of currency politics and unintended consequences fascinated you, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. We explore these hidden dynamics of power and money every week. And if you want to dive even deeper into the forces shaping our world, check out the video appearing on screen now. I'll see you there.